She stood in the doorway of my lake house wearing designer sunglasses and a smile that could cut glass, telling me I had 48 hours to pack my things and leave. The property deed had my name on it, the mortgage payments came from my account, and every piece of furniture had been chosen by me over 7 years of careful restoration. But my brother's wife, Madison, had decided the house should be hers, and she had convinced him that family loyalty meant I should simply hand over the keys. I looked at her perfectly manicured nails drumming against my doorframe and said nothing. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply stepped aside and let her walk through my home like she already owned it. She had no idea that by midnight that same night, she would be the one leaving, and she would never set foot in my house again. If you have ever been told that your hard work means nothing, that your boundaries do not matter, that you should sacrifice what is yours for someone who has never sacrificed anything, then stay with me. This is the story of how silence became my greatest weapon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started the way most Saturday mornings at the lake house did, with sunlight filtering through the pine trees and the sound of water lapping gently against the dock. I had been awake since 5:30, as was my habit, making coffee in the French press that I had brought back from a trip to Vancouver 3 years earlier. The kitchen smelled of dark roast and the faint sweetness of the wild roses that grew along the eastern side of the property. I stood at the window that overlooked the lake, watching the mist rise off the water in thin columns that dissolved into the morning air, and felt the particular kind of peace that only comes from being in a place you have built with your own hands and your own vision. The lake house sat on 2 acres of wooded property in northern Wisconsin, about 40 minutes outside of Rhinelander. I had purchased the property 7 years ago when I was 31 years old, using money I had saved from working as a civil engineer for a firm in Milwaukee. The house itself had been a disaster when I bought it, a 1970s structure with brown paneling, orange shag carpet, and a roof that leaked in at least 6 places. Everyone I knew had told me I was making a mistake, that the property was too remote, too outdated, too much work for someone who already put in 60-hour weeks at her job. My brother Christopher had laughed when I showed him the listing photos and said I should just set the money on fire because at least then I would not have to drive 4 hours north to watch it rot. But I had seen something in the property that others had not. The bones of the house were solid. The location was spectacular with direct lake access and mature trees that provided privacy and beauty, and most importantly, it was mine. For the first time in my life, I would own something that no one could take away from me. Something that reflected my choices rather than compromises or family expectations. I spent every weekend for 2 years driving up from Milwaukee, tearing out walls, refinishing floors, replacing windows, and learning skills I had never imagined I would need. I taught myself tile work from YouTube videos, figured out electrical wiring from library books, and called in favors from colleagues when I needed help with the structural elements beyond my expertise. The transformation had been remarkable. I stripped away decades of poor design choices and revealed the clean lines and natural beauty that the original structure had always possessed. I installed large windows that brought the outside in, built a wraparound deck from reclaimed cedar, and designed an open floor plan that made the modest square footage feel spacious and welcoming. Every light fixture, every paint color, every piece of hardware had been selected with care and intention. The house became a reflection of who I was, someone who valued simplicity, quality, and the kind of beauty that comes from honest materials and thoughtful design. My brother Christopher had a different life entirely. He had married Madison Pierce 4 years ago in a wedding that cost more than my entire house renovation. Madison came from a wealthy family in Lake Forest, and she had very specific ideas about how life should look. She did not work, as she explained to anyone who asked, because Christopher's position as a pharmaceutical sales representative provided more than enough income for them to live comfortably. What she actually meant was that her trust fund and Christopher's 6-figure salary allowed them to maintain a lifestyle of country club memberships, luxury vacations, and a home in an exclusive suburb where the lawn care alone cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Madison had never understood my attachment to the lake house. The few times she and Christopher had visited during the early renovation years, she had spent the entire time complaining about the lack of cell service, the distance from decent shopping, and the rustic quality of everything from the well water to the gravel driveway. She would run her fingers along surfaces looking for dust, make comments about how much work it must be to maintain such an old place, and suggest that I would be much happier if I just sold the property and used the money for something more practical like investing in a nice condo in a city where I could actually have a social life. I had learned to ignore her commentary, to recognize it as a fundamental difference in values rather than a personal attack. Madison measured worth by price tags and postal codes, by brands and square footage in the right neighborhoods. I measured worth by craftsmanship, by the satisfaction of building something with your own hands, by the peace that comes from watching sunrise over water you can swim in rather than water you pay to access at a resort. We simply saw the world differently, and I had accepted that we would never understand each other's choices. Christopher and I had been close as children, only 2 years apart in age, partners in the particular adventures and conflicts that siblings create together. But as adults we had drifted into very different lives. He had embraced conventional success with enthusiasm, climbing corporate ladders and collecting the symbols of achievement that society recognizes and celebrates. I had chosen a path that prioritized independence and authenticity over appearance and advancement. Neither path was wrong, but they were incompatible in many ways, and over the years our relationship had become polite and distant, maintained through holiday gatherings and occasional phone calls rather than genuine closeness. Our parents, Robert and Linda Chambers, lived in the same Milwaukee suburb where we had grown up. My father was a retired accountant, my mother a former elementary school teacher, who now volunteered extensively with various charitable organizations. They were good people, kind and supportive in their way, but they had always understood Christopher better than they understood me. His choices made sense to them because those choices aligned with the values they had tried to instill in both of us. Work hard, build security, find a good partner, create a stable life that neighbors and relatives can point to as evidence of success. My choices confused them. Why would I spend all my time and money on a remote property when I could be building equity in a home closer to family and career opportunities? Why did I prefer solitude and projects over the social activities and relationships that led to traditional markers of adult success? They never said I was wrong, but I could feel their concern, their worry that I was somehow missing out on the life I should be living. Christopher's wedding had been a particular trial, with my mother constantly introducing me to single men and making comments about how nice it would be when I found someone and settled down like my brother had. I had long since made peace with being the family puzzle, the daughter and sister who did not quite fit the expected pattern. I had my work, which I found challenging and meaningful. I had my house, which brought me more satisfaction than anything else I had ever accomplished. I had friends, though they were few and carefully chosen, people who understood my need for quiet and space, who appreciated authenticity over performance. My life might not look like much from the outside, but it was wholly mine, and that had always been enough. On this particular Saturday morning in early June, I had been planning to spend the day working on the garden beds I was installing along the western side of the property. The soil was finally warm enough for planting, and I had flats of native perennials waiting in the garage, species that would attract pollinators and require minimal maintenance once established. I was wearing old jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, my hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, my hands already dirty from the first hour of digging I had done before stopping for coffee. I heard the car before I saw it, the sound of expensive tires on gravel carrying clearly through the morning quiet. I glanced at the clock on the microwave and frowned. It was barely 7:30, too early for casual visitors, and I was not expecting anyone. I walked to the front window and saw Christopher's black luxury SUV pulling into my driveway, the vehicle incongruous against the backdrop of pine trees and understated lakeside architecture. Madison emerged first, before Christopher had even turned off the engine. She was wearing white linen pants that would be impractical for any outdoor activity, a silk blouse in pale blue, and oversized sunglasses despite the fact that the sun was still relatively low on the horizon. Her blonde hair was styled in the kind of waves that require professional attention, and even from a distance I could see the glint of her wedding jewelry catching the light. Christopher followed more slowly, wearing khakis and a polo shirt, his expression uncomfortable in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten with apprehension. I opened the door before they could knock, stepping out onto the porch rather than inviting them inside. Some instinct told me to maintain boundaries, to keep this interaction in neutral territory, rather than allowing them into my private space. Madison pulled off her sunglasses with a dramatic gesture and smiled at me with too many teeth showing. Emma, darling, I hope we are not interrupting anything important, she said in the tone that women use when they absolutely know they are interrupting but do not particularly care. Her eyes traveled over my work clothes and dirty hands with barely concealed disdain. Christopher and I were just discussing the house on our drive up, and we realized it was absolutely essential that we have a conversation with you right away before things get any more complicated. I looked at Christopher, who would not quite meet my eyes. He had his hands shoved into his pockets and was staring at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. Chris? What is this about? Madison answered before he could. Why don't we go inside where we can sit down and discuss this properly? I would hate for the neighbors to overhear sensitive family matters. She gestured vaguely toward the lake as though my nearest neighbors were not separated from my property by hundreds of yards of forest and private shoreline. I do not mind standing, I said evenly. And I do not have any plans that require sitting down. What did you need to discuss? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Madison's smile tightened slightly, but she maintained her pleasant expression with visible effort. Well, as you know, Christopher and I have been looking for a vacation property for quite some time. Something quiet and private where we can escape from the pressures of our busy lives. Somewhere we can bring clients and colleagues for retreats and relationship building. We have been working with a realtor for over a year now, and everything we have looked at has been either too expensive, too run down, or too far from civilization. I said nothing, just watched her with growing understanding of where this conversation was heading. Christopher shifted his weight from foot to foot and studied the porch boards with intense concentration. And then it occurred to us, Madison continued, her voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow student, that the perfect solution has been right here in the family all along. This property is absolutely ideal for what we need. The location is convenient enough for weekend trips, but remote enough to feel like a proper getaway. The house is already renovated and furnished, so we would not have to go through that tedious process. And most importantly, it makes sense to keep this property in the family rather than having it sit empty most of the time while you are down in Milwaukee working. The morning air suddenly felt colder despite the warming sun. I looked at Christopher again, willing him to look back at me, to say something that would indicate he understood how insane this conversation was. He finally met my eyes for a brief second before looking away again, and I saw something in his expression that was worse than agreement. He looked resigned, like he had already given up any intention of defending me or questioning his wife's plan. Madison, I said slowly, keeping my voice level despite the anger beginning to build in my chest. This is my house. I bought it. I renovated it. I pay the mortgage and the property taxes and the insurance. I spend almost every weekend here. It does not sit empty. It is my home. She waved one hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the sunlight. Oh, I know you are attached to it, and that is completely understandable. You have put so much work into it and it shows. Really, you have done a beautiful job with the renovations. But Emma, be realistic. You are a single woman living in Milwaukee with a demanding career. How much time can you really spend up here? Maybe 1 or 2 weekends a month during the summer. The property is wasted on someone who can only use it part-time. Christopher and I could be up here every weekend hosting gatherings, building his professional network, actually making full use of everything the property has to offer. I do not care how much time you think you would spend here, I said, my voice harder now. The house is not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. This is not a family property. It is my property, and this conversation is over. Madison's pleasant mask slipped, revealing the steel underneath. She stepped closer to me, invading my personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. You are being incredibly selfish, Emma. Christopher is your only brother. Family is supposed to support each other, supposed to help each other succeed. Do you have any idea how important the next few years are for Christopher's career? He is being considered for a regional director position, which means he needs to be cultivating relationships with senior leadership and key clients. Having a property like this where he can host informal gatherings and retreats could make all the difference in whether he gets that promotion. Then he should buy his own property, I said flatly. Like I did. With his own money. Through his own effort. Christopher finally spoke, his voice strained. Emma, just hear us out. We are not asking you to give us the house. We are thinking more like a family arrangement where we would take over the mortgage payments and the property expenses, and you could still come up whenever we are not using it. Sort of like a timeshare situation but within the family. It would actually save you money. The audacity of it took my breath away for a moment. They wanted me to hand over my house, the home I had built from nothing through 7 years of weekends and savings and physical labor, and frame it as though they were doing me a favor. They wanted me to become a guest in my own home, someone who could visit when it was convenient for them, when their schedule and their guests and their networking events allowed for the actual owner to spend time in her own property. No, I said simply. The answer is no. This is my house. You need to leave. Madison's expression transformed completely, the pleasant facade evaporating like morning mist. Her face hardened into something cold and calculating, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. Fine. If you want to be difficult about this, then let me be perfectly clear. Christopher and I are prepared to make this happen with or without your cooperation. His parents have already agreed that the property should go to their son, that it makes more sense for the family as a whole if Christopher has this asset rather than you keeping it for your little solo retreats. His parents. I repeated, the words not quite making sense. You mean our parents? My parents and Christopher's parents, who are the same people. I mean, Madison said with exaggerated patience, that Robert and Linda have made it very clear where their priorities are. They understand that Christopher has a family to build, a career to advance, and frankly better prospects for actually using this property in a way that benefits everyone. You have had your fun playing renovation project, but it is time for you to step aside and let the adults make decisions about family assets. The rage that rose in me was different from anything I had felt before, cold and clear rather than hot and blinding. I looked at Christopher, who at least had the decency to look deeply uncomfortable but still said nothing in my defense. Get off my property, I said quietly. Both of you. Now. Madison did not move. Instead, she pulled out her phone and tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward me. Before we go, I want you to see something. Christopher and I have already spoken with a real estate attorney about our options. Apparently, since your parents helped you with the down payment when you originally purchased this property, there is a legal argument that they maintain a partial ownership interest. And if they choose to exercise that interest by transferring their share to Christopher, well, that would make him a co-owner whether you like it or not. The words hit like a physical blow. It was true that my parents had given me $20,000 as a gift toward the down payment 7 years ago. At the time, they had called it an early inheritance, money they wanted me to have while they were still alive to see me use it. There had been no strings attached, no mention of ownership interest or future claims. It had been a gift from parents to daughter, documented as such in all the paperwork. But Madison was suggesting they could retroactively claim it as something else, as an investment that gave them ownership rights. That is not how gifts work, I said, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. I was an engineer, not a lawyer. I had no idea what legal arguments might or might not be possible, what claims could be manufactured through clever interpretation of years-old transactions. Madison smiled, seeing the doubt in my expression. Maybe it is not. But are you really prepared to fight your own parents in court? To drag your family through legal proceedings and destroy whatever relationship you have left with them? All over a house? She stepped even closer, her voice dropping to something that was almost intimate in its cruelty. You have never understood how the world actually works, Emma. You have always thought that your hard work and your independence make you special, make you untouchable. But family loyalty matters more than individual effort. And right now, you are the one standing in the way of what is best for the family. She straightened up and put her sunglasses back on, the gesture marking the end of the conversation as far as she was concerned. We are giving you 48 hours to think about this and come to the reasonable conclusion. You can either work with us voluntarily and make this easy for everyone, or we can pursue the legal options we have discussed with the attorney. Either way, Christopher is getting this house. The only question is whether you want to preserve some dignity and family relationships in the process, or whether you want to be the selfish sister who forced her own parents to take legal action against her. She turned and walked back toward the SUV, her heels crunching on the gravel driveway. Christopher hesitated for a moment, his mouth opening as though he might say something, but then he just shook his head and followed his wife. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away, the sound of the expensive engine fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the wind in the pines and the gentle sound of the lake. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was still holding my coffee mug though the contents had long since gone cold. I walked back inside and set the mug carefully on the kitchen counter, then stood in the middle of my living room looking at everything I had built, everything I had created through my own vision and effort. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows I had installed, warming the floors I had refinished, illuminating the walls I had painted. Every single element of this space represented a choice I had made, a problem I had solved, a piece of myself I had invested into transforming something broken into something beautiful. And now my brother and his wife wanted to take it from me, wanted me to simply step aside and hand over not just the physical property but all the meaning and accomplishment it represented. They wanted me to accept that my work did not matter, that my ownership did not matter, that what I wanted and needed and valued could be dismissed because they had decided it would be more convenient for them to have what I had built. I walked slowly through the house, touching surfaces and remembering the work that had gone into each element. The kitchen cabinets I had stripped and refinished by hand, spending weeks with chemical stripper and sandpaper to reveal the beautiful oak hidden under layers of cheap paint. The bathroom tile I had installed after watching dozens of tutorial videos and practicing on sample boards until I understood the technique well enough to trust myself with the real materials. The deck I had built with help from a colleague, the two of us spending an entire summer weekend getting the measurements perfect, ensuring every board was level, creating something that would last for decades. This house was not just a vacation property or a real estate asset. It was proof that I was capable of more than people expected, that I could envision something and make it real through patience and persistence and willingness to learn skills outside my comfort zone. It was the physical manifestation of my independence, my ability to create the life I wanted rather than accepting the life others thought I should have. Losing this house would not just mean losing a building. It would mean losing the evidence of my own competence and agency. I thought about Madison's threat regarding my parents, about the claim that they were aligned with Christopher's desire to take the property. I pulled out my phone and stared at my mother's contact information for a long moment before finally pressing the call button. She answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful and unsuspecting. "Emma, sweetheart, this is a lovely surprise. I was just thinking about you. Your father and I are planning to come up to the lake house next month for a visit if that works with your schedule." "Mom," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Did you and Dad tell Christopher and Madison that they should have my house? Did you tell them that you think the property should go to Christopher instead of me?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I knew the answer before she spoke. When she finally responded, her tone had shifted from cheerful to careful, the voice she used when she was trying to manage a situation rather than simply communicate. "Emma, honey, Christopher called us last week and explained his situation. He and Madison have been looking for a vacation property, and he mentioned that your house would actually be perfect for what they need. We just suggested that maybe the family could work something out that would benefit everyone. You know how important the next few years are for Christopher's career, and having a property like that where he could host his colleagues could really make a difference in his opportunities." "So you did," I said flatly. "You told them you think they should have my house. We just think it would be nice if you could share it," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "You are up there alone most of the time anyway, and Christopher has a family to think about, responsibilities and pressures that require certain accommodations. It does not seem unreasonable to ask you to be a little flexible, to put family needs ahead of your personal preferences." The betrayal was surprisingly painful despite the fact that I should have expected it. My parents had always prioritized Christopher, always found reasons why his needs should come first, why his path was more important than mine. I had thought that maybe the gift of the down payment years ago had represented some recognition of my worth, some acknowledgement that I deserved support and investment. But apparently it had just been money, easily given and easily reclaimed when it served their preferred child's interests. "The down payment you gave me 7 years ago," I said slowly. "Did you keep any documentation that would suggest it was a loan or an investment rather than a gift?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Emma, why are you asking about that?" "Because Madison is threatening to claim that you have ownership interest in my house based on that money, That you could transfer your share to Christopher and make him a co-owner whether I agree or not. I need to know if there is any legal basis for that threat. My mother sighed, and I could picture her pinching the bridge of her nose the way she did when she was frustrated with situations she considered unnecessarily complicated. Madison mentioned that possibility when she and Christopher came to talk to us. We told her we would not do anything like that the money was a gift and we have no interest in making legal claims. But Emma, the fact that we even have to have this kind of conversation, that you are so unwilling to be reasonable about sharing the property with your own brother, it is really disappointing. This is not how we raised you. The irony would have been funny if it were not so painful. I was being unreasonable for wanting to keep the property I had purchased and renovated with my own labor and savings. I was disappointing my parents by refusing to hand over my home to my brother because it would be convenient for his career advancement. The expectations had always been asymmetrical in my family. The standards applied to me vastly different from those applied to Christopher, but I had never felt the unfairness quite so acutely as I did in that moment. I need to go, I said quietly. I have work to do. Emma, please do not be this way. Can we just talk about this reasonably? Maybe if you came down to Milwaukee and we all sat down together as a family, we could work out an arrangement that everyone could feel good about. Goodbye, Mom, I said, and ended the call before she could respond. I stood in my living room with my phone in my hand, feeling the foundation of my world shifting beneath me in ways I could not quite process. My brother wanted my house. His wife was threatening legal action. My parents thought I was being selfish for refusing to simply hand over the property I had built. Everything I had accomplished here, everything this place represented, was being dismissed as negotiable because other people had decided their needs were more important than my rights. But as I stood there processing the shock and betrayal, something else began to emerge beneath the hurt. A cold, clear determination that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with absolute certainty. This was my house. I had earned it. I had built it. And no one was going to take it from me through manipulation, threats, or appeals to family loyalty that had apparently never applied equally to all family members. Madison had said I would have 48 hours to think about it, to come to what she considered the reasonable conclusion. She had assumed that pressure from my parents, threats of legal action, and the weight of family disapproval would be enough to make me capitulate, to convince me that keeping my home was not worth the fight. She was wrong. I walked into my office, a small room off the main living area that I had converted into a workspace with built-in shelving, and a desk that faced the window overlooking the lake. I opened my laptop and began making notes, documenting everything that had been said during the confrontation, the specific threats Madison had made, and the timeline of events. Then I searched for real estate attorneys in the area, looking for someone who specialized in property rights and ownership disputes. Whatever was going to happen next, I would be prepared for it. I would not be bullied out of my own home by people who valued convenience over ethics, who believed that wanting something was the same as deserving it. Madison thought she could intimidate me into submission by showing up at my door with ultimatums and 48-hour deadlines. She had no idea what she had just started. The hours following Christopher and Madison's departure felt surreal, as though I were moving through my own life at a slight remove from reality. I sat at my desk with my laptop open, staring at search results for real estate attorneys, but my mind kept circling back to the fundamental question that seemed to underpin everything that had just happened. How had my brother and his wife convinced themselves that their desire for my property constituted any kind of legitimate claim to it? What series of thoughts and conversations had led them to believe that showing up at my door with demands and ultimatums was a reasonable approach to getting something they wanted? I closed the laptop and walked back out to the kitchen, needing to do something physical to ground myself in the present moment. The garden beds I had planned to work on were still waiting, the flats of perennials still sitting in the garage where I had left them before the morning's confrontation. I changed into proper work clothes, gathered my tools, and went outside to dig in the earth, to put my hands in soil and feel the simple satisfaction of creating something that would grow and flourish over time. The physical work helped clear my mind, allowed me to process what had happened while my body engaged in the repetitive motions of digging, amending soil, and carefully positioning plants according to their eventual mature size and sunlight requirements. As I worked, I found myself thinking not about the confrontation itself but about the history that had led to it, the patterns and dynamics that had made Christopher and Madison believe their approach would be successful. My relationship with Christopher had not always been strained or distant. As children, we had been genuinely close, the kind of siblings who created elaborate imaginary worlds together and defended each other against neighborhood bullies. He was only 2 years older than me, close enough in age that we attended the same schools and often had overlapping social circles. I remembered summer afternoons spent building forts in the backyard, winter evenings playing board games when the snow made outdoor activities impossible, and the particular shorthand communication that develops between siblings who grow up in close proximity. But even then, there had been differences in how our parents treated us, subtle patterns that became more pronounced as we got older. Christopher had always been the child who drew attention naturally, the one who was loud and confident and willing to perform for adults who found his precociousness charming. I had been quieter, more observant, content to watch and listen rather than dominate conversations. Our parents had interpreted these personality differences as indicators of future potential, with Christopher's extroversion seen as leadership quality, and my introversion viewed as something that would need to be overcome if I wanted to succeed in life. School had reinforced these perceptions. Christopher had been popular, elected to student council, captain of the soccer team, homecoming king during his senior year. He had earned good grades without appearing to work particularly hard, giving the impression of effortless achievement that adults found impressive. I had also earned good grades, but through visible effort and dedication, through hours spent studying and completing assignments with meticulous care. Somehow my harder work had made my accomplishments seem less valuable, as though success that required effort was inherently inferior to success that appeared to come naturally. Our parents had never explicitly favored Christopher, but the evidence was there in small moments and accumulated patterns. They attended all of his soccer games but only made it to some of my academic competitions. They displayed his awards prominently in the living room while mine ended up on a shelf in my bedroom. When college application time came, they encouraged him to apply to prestigious universities without much discussion of cost, while I was steered toward state schools with merit scholarships that would minimize the financial burden on the family. The message was clear even if unspoken. Christopher's potential was worth investing in without reservation, while my education needed to be approached more conservatively, more practically. I had not resented these differences at the time, or at least I had not recognized my feelings as resentment. I had simply accepted that Christopher was the golden child, the one whose achievements mattered more, whose needs took priority. I had learned to find satisfaction in my own accomplishments independent of whether anyone else recognized or celebrated them. This pattern had served me well in some ways, teaching me self-reliance and the ability to define success on my own terms. But it had also created a dynamic where I had learned not to expect support or advocacy from my family, had learned that my interests would generally come second to Christopher's whenever there was any conflict or competition for resources. Christopher had gone to Northwestern University, an expensive private institution where he majored in business, and joined a fraternity that specialized in networking and social connections. Our parents had been enormously proud, attending parents' weekends and displaying Northwestern gear prominently. I had attended the University of Wisconsin, earning a degree in civil engineering through a combination of scholarships, part-time work, and careful budgeting. I had graduated with minimal debt and multiple job offers, but somehow my practical success had seemed less impressive than Christopher's more prestigious educational experience. After graduation, Christopher had moved to Chicago and taken a job in pharmaceutical sales, a position that came with a company car, expense account, and significant earning potential for someone willing to work the social aspects of the job. He had always been good at reading people, at knowing what to say to make others feel important and understood, and these skills translated well into sales. Within 3 years he had been promoted twice and was earning a 6-figure salary while living in a trendy neighborhood and dating women who looked like they belonged in fashion magazines. I had taken a position with a civil engineering firm in Milwaukee, starting at a modest salary that would grow steadily but not spectacularly over time. My work involved designing infrastructure systems, ensuring that buildings and developments had proper water, sewage, and drainage solutions. It was technical work that required precision and problem-solving ability, but offered little in the way of glamour or social recognition. When people asked what I did for a living, their eyes tended to glaze over as soon as I mentioned engineering, whereas Christopher's pharmaceutical sales position somehow sounded more interesting and dynamic despite being essentially a sales job. Christopher had met Madison at a charity gala in Lake Forest 4.5 years ago. She had been there with her parents, prominent donors to various cultural institutions, and Christopher had been attending as a representative of his pharmaceutical company. According to the story he told later, they had immediately connected over shared interests in travel, fine dining, and the kind of lifestyle that required significant disposable income to maintain. They had been engaged within 6 months and married 6 months after that in a wedding that was featured in the society pages of the Chicago Tribune. I had been a bridesmaid in the wedding, standing on the altar in a dress that cost more than my monthly rent, and watching my brother marry a woman I barely knew. Madison had been polite to me during the engagement period but had made little effort to actually get to know me. She seemed to view me as Christopher's sister who worked in engineering and lived alone in Milwaukee, a perfectly acceptable person but not particularly interesting or relevant to her life. I had tried to make conversation at various wedding events, but we had no common ground, no shared interests or values that would support genuine friendship. The wedding itself had been a spectacle, held at a country club with hundreds of guests, multiple courses of gourmet food, and entertainment that included a string quartet, a jazz band, and a DJ for the late-night dancing. My parents had been absolutely delighted, basking in the reflected glory of their son's successful marriage to a woman from a prominent family. They had introduced Madison to everyone they knew with obvious pride, emphasizing her family connections and the lovely wedding they were attending. I had stood in my expensive bridesmaid dress and watched my parents celebrate Christopher's achievement in finding such an impressive partner, and I had felt the familiar weight of being the less significant child, the one whose accomplishments would never inspire the same level of parental pride. After the wedding, Christopher and Madison had settled into married life in Lake Forest, purchasing a home in an exclusive neighborhood where the average property value exceeded $2 million. Madison did not work, explaining that her education from an elite liberal arts college had been more about personal development than career preparation, and that Christopher's income made outside employment unnecessary. She filled her days with tennis lessons, charity committee meetings, and social lunches with other women from similar backgrounds. Christopher continued advancing in his pharmaceutical sales career, earning promotions and bonuses that funded increasingly elaborate vacations and luxury purchases. I had continued my own life in Milwaukee, advancing steadily in my engineering career and saving money with the kind of discipline that comes from knowing no one else will provide financial security for you. I had been promoted to senior engineer after 5 years with my firm, taking on more complex projects and mentoring younger colleagues. My salary had increased enough that I could afford to save substantial amounts each month, while still maintaining a comfortable if modest lifestyle. I had no interest in luxury goods or status symbols, preferring to spend my money on experiences and on the lake house project that was slowly taking shape. The lake house had become my obsession and my sanctuary. Every weekend I would drive the 4 hours north from Milwaukee, arriving Friday evening and staying until Sunday afternoon. I would spend my days working on whatever phase of the renovation was current, teaching myself new skills through online tutorials and library books, calling in favors from colleagues when I needed help with tasks that required 2 people or specialized expertise. The work was physically demanding and often frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way my professional engineering work sometimes was not. When I designed drainage systems for commercial developments, I was solving technical problems and ensuring functionality, but I rarely saw the finished result or felt personal connection to the outcome. When I worked on the lake house, every decision mattered to me personally. Every improvement was something I would live with and enjoy. Every problem I solved made my own life better. The house became a reflection of my capabilities and my vision, in a way that nothing else in my life could match. Christopher and Madison had visited the lake house perhaps 4 times over the 7 years I had owned it. The first visit had been early in the renovation process when the house still had the brown paneling and orange carpet. They had stayed for perhaps 2 hours, with Madison making increasingly pointed comments about the smell of mildew and the lack of decent coffee shops in the area. Christopher had looked around with what I interpreted as pity, asking if I was sure I knew what I was getting into with such an extensive renovation project. The second visit had been about 2 years later when I had made significant progress, but the house was still clearly under construction. They had stayed for 1 night, sleeping in the only finished bedroom while I took the couch. Madison had spent most of the visit on her phone trying to find cell signal and complaining about the shower pressure. Christopher had acknowledged that the renovation was coming along nicely but suggested I should consider hiring professionals to finish the work rather than continuing to do everything myself, as though my choice to do the work personally was driven by inability to afford help rather than desire to build something with my own hands. The third visit had been for a weekend about 4 years into the project when I had finished most of the interior work and was focusing on exterior improvements. They had brought another couple with them, pharmaceutical sales colleagues of Christopher's who were apparently considering purchasing vacation property themselves. The entire weekend had felt like an evaluation, with Madison and Christopher's friends walking through my house making comments about what they would do differently, what choices I had made that they would not have made. I had felt like a tour guide in my own home, expected to explain and justify my decisions to people who had no actual interest in understanding my vision or appreciating the work I had put into executing it. The fourth and most recent visit had been the previous summer, about a year before the confrontation that had occurred this morning. They had come up for a single day, ostensibly to swim and enjoy the lake. Madison had spent the entire time taking photographs for her social media accounts, posing on my deck and dock as though she were at an exclusive resort. She had asked me repeatedly to move out of frame or to take photos of her from various angles. Christopher had spent most of the day on work calls, pacing around my property while discussing sales strategies and client relationships. Neither of them had expressed any appreciation for the house or acknowledgement of the work that had gone into creating the space they were now using as a backdrop for their lifestyle documentation. I had felt used after that visit, had recognized that they did not actually value the lake house for what it was but only for how it could serve their purposes. They did not care about the craftsmanship or the thoughtful design choices, or the way the house integrated with its natural surroundings. They simply saw a useful amenity, a resource that existed for their benefit. I had decided after that visit that I would not invite them back, that their presence in my space made me uncomfortable in a way I could not fully articulate but that felt important to honor. And now, a year later, they had shown up uninvited to inform me that they intended to take the house from me, that they believed their desire for the property constituted sufficient justification for demanding I give it up. The audacity was staggering, but as I thought about the history of our relationships and our family dynamics, I realized it was not entirely surprising. Christopher had always gotten what he wanted through some combination of charm, parental support, and sheer confidence that he deserved good things. Madison came from a world where money and connections made most things accessible, where wanting something was often enough to obtain it. Together, they had probably genuinely convinced themselves that taking my house was reasonable, that the obstacles to getting what they wanted were merely technical problems to be solved through the right combination of pressure and incentives. They had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what the house meant to me. They saw someone who would eventually capitulate because family harmony mattered more than individual rights, because avoiding conflict was more important than maintaining boundaries. They saw someone who had always been second priority, second choice, someone who should understand her place in the family hierarchy and act accordingly. What they had failed to see was that the lake house had changed me, or perhaps had revealed something about me that had always been there but had never before had opportunity to fully express itself. Through the process of purchasing this property and transforming it from wreck to refuge, I had discovered that I was capable of far more than I had believed possible. I had learned that my vision and judgment were reliable, that I could solve complex problems through research and persistence, that I could create something beautiful and functional through my own effort and determination. The house was not just a building. It was evidence of my competence and autonomy, proof that I did not need anyone's permission or support to accomplish significant things. Taking the house from me would not simply mean losing a vacation property. It would mean erasing the proof of my own capabilities, allowing my accomplishments to be dismissed as negotiable and transferable, based on other people's convenience. I had spent 38 years learning to accept that my achievements would never be celebrated the way Christopher's were, that I would always be the less important child, the less impressive sibling. But I had also learned to find validation internally, to know my own worth independent of external recognition. This was the line I would not allow anyone to cross. They could dismiss my career as less prestigious than Christopher's. They could ignore my accomplishments and focus all their attention on my brother's successes. They could maintain their belief that I was somehow less valuable or less deserving of support. But they could not take what I had built with my own hands, could not erase the physical evidence that I was capable of transforming vision into reality through sustained effort and skill development. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting long shadows across the property, I finished planting the last of the perennials and stood back to survey my work. The garden beds would need time to establish, would require consistent watering and care before the plants developed root systems strong enough to survive on their own. But with patience and attention they would thrive, would create exactly the effect I had envisioned when I first designed this element of the landscaping. The process was familiar now, the pattern of working toward a long-term vision while handling immediate practical needs. I cleaned my tools and stored them in the garage, then went inside to shower and change into clean clothes. My body ached in the particular way that comes from hours of physical labor, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that comes from productive work rather than injury or strain. I made dinner from the supplies I kept at the lake house, simple food that tasted better than it should have because I was eating it in a space I had created, surrounded by evidence of my own competence and vision. After dinner, I returned to my laptop and resumed the research I had begun earlier. I needed to understand my legal position thoroughly, needed to know what threats Madison and Christopher could actually follow through on, and what claims were merely intimidation tactics designed to make me surrender without fight. I read through Wisconsin property law, searched for information about ownership rights and the requirements for establishing co-ownership claims, and made notes about questions I would need to ask when I found an attorney to consult. The research was sobering in some ways and reassuring in others. The gift my parents had given me for the down payment was clearly documented as a gift, with tax forms and written correspondence that explicitly described the money as an early inheritance with no expectation of repayment or ownership interest. Unless my parents were willing to commit fraud by claiming they had different intentions at the time, there was no legitimate legal basis for establishing co-ownership based on that transaction. However, I also learned that family property disputes could become complicated and expensive, even when the legal merits were clearly on one side, because courts often tried to find compromise solutions that preserved family relationships rather than simply enforcing strict property rights. This meant that even though I was clearly the sole legal owner of the property, I could potentially face lengthy and costly legal proceedings if my family chose to pursue litigation. The attorney fees alone could be substantial, and there was always some risk that a judge might find creative ways to force negotiation or settlement, even when the law itself was unambiguous. The realization was frustrating but not surprising. The legal system often prioritized conflict resolution over strict justice, preferring outcomes that split differences rather than vindicated clear rights. As I read through case law and legal analysis, I began to understand that my strongest protection was not primarily legal but practical. If I could demonstrate that pursuing litigation would be costly, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed, Christopher and Madison might decide the effort was not worth the potential gain. This meant I needed to be prepared to fight if necessary, needed to have legal representation ready, and needed to make clear that I would not be intimidated into settlement by the mere threat of legal action. I began compiling a list of real estate attorneys in the area, focusing on those who specialized in property rights and ownership disputes. I would begin calling them on Monday morning, would find someone who could review my documentation, and provide clear assessment of my legal position. I would also need to have difficult conversations with my parents, would need to understand exactly what they had told Christopher and Madison, and whether they actually intended to support any legal claims, or were simply unwilling to contradict Christopher's plans. The thought of confronting my parents was exhausting. I had spent decades managing their expectations and accepting their prioritization of Christopher, had learned not to expect support or advocacy when my interests conflicted with his. But this situation was different in scale and significance. They needed to understand that staying neutral was not an option, that their refusal to clearly support my ownership rights would be interpreted as endorsement of Christopher's attempt to take my property. As the evening wore on and the lake house settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, I found myself thinking about Madison's parting words, her claim that I had 48 hours to think about their demands and come to what she considered the reasonable conclusion. The timeline was clearly designed to create pressure, to make me feel that I needed to respond quickly before they escalated to whatever next phase they had planned. It was a classic negotiation tactic, creating artificial urgency to force hasty decisions. But I had no intention of responding on their timeline, or according to their expectations. I would take whatever time I needed to understand my position and prepare my response. I would not be rushed into decisions by artificial deadlines or intimidated by vague threats of legal action. If they wanted to pursue litigation, they would discover that I was prepared to defend my rights for as long as necessary and at whatever cost required. The house was worth fighting for, not because of its monetary value but because of what it represented about my capability and autonomy. I thought about Madison's assumption that I would eventually capitulate, that family pressure and the threat of conflict would be enough to make me surrender. She had looked at me and seen someone who could be pushed, someone who valued peace more than justice, someone who would ultimately choose the path of least resistance. She had been so confident in her assessment, so certain that her approach would work. She was about to discover how wrong she had been. The person standing in her way was not the accommodating sister who had spent decades accepting second place in the family hierarchy. I was someone who had spent 7 years transforming a wreck into a refuge through nothing but determination and acquired skill. I was someone who had learned that I was capable of far more than anyone had expected, including myself. I was someone who had discovered that being underestimated was actually an advantage, because it meant no one was prepared for the reality of my strength and resolve. Tomorrow was Sunday, and I would spend it exactly as I had planned before the morning's disruption. I would work on the property, would continue the endless process of maintenance and improvement that came with owning an older home. I would enjoy the peace and beauty of the location I had chosen and the space I had created. I would live my life as though nothing had changed because fundamentally nothing had changed. This was still my house, I was still the sole legal owner, and no amount of demanding or threatening would alter those facts. Monday would be time enough to begin the practical work of defending my rights and establishing consequences for people who believed they could take what did not belong to them. For now, I would simply be present in my home, surrounded by evidence of my own competence, secure in the knowledge that I had built something worth defending, and that I possessed the strength to do so for as long as necessary. The night settled fully over the lake, bringing with it the particular quality of darkness that only exists far from city lights. I stood at the window looking out at the water barely visible under starlight, and I felt something settle inside me that might have been resolve or might simply have been recognition. This was my line. This was where I stopped accommodating, stopped accepting, stopped making myself smaller to preserve other people's comfort. Madison had demanded that I leave my own house. She had given me 48 hours to comply with her wishes. She had assumed that her confidence and her threats would be sufficient to make me surrender. She had been so certain that she had already won, that the outcome was merely a matter of working through the technical details of my capitulation. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did Christopher. Neither did my parents. They had all made assumptions based on decades of observing my behavior, based on patterns they believed were fixed and unchangeable. They did not understand that patterns can shift when circumstances reach certain thresholds, that patience and accommodation are choices that can be withdrawn when they are no longer appropriate responses to the situation at hand. The 48-hour deadline would pass without response from me. They would interpret my silence however they chose. And then we would discover what happened when someone who had been underestimated for decades finally decided that being underestimated was no longer serving her interests. The story was just beginning, and I was the only one who fully understood how it would unfold. Sunday morning arrived with fog rolling across the lake, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and mysterious. I woke early as always, the habit so ingrained that my body no longer required an alarm clock to pull me from sleep at the appropriate hour. The house was cool and quiet, filled with the particular stillness that comes just before dawn when even the birds have not yet begun their morning chorus. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the fog slowly lift as the sun rose higher, revealing the world in gradual increments rather than all at once. The events of the previous day felt simultaneously distant and immediately present, as though they had happened both long ago and just moments before. I had slept surprisingly well despite the confrontation with Christopher and Madison, despite the conversation with my mother that had revealed the extent of my family's willingness to prioritize my brother's desires over my rights. Perhaps the sleep had come from a kind of clarity that arrives when uncertainty resolves into definite knowledge. I now understood exactly where everyone stood, exactly what I was facing, and exactly what needed to be done. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by the sharp edges of confirmed reality. I spent the morning working on routine maintenance tasks that the house required, the kind of ongoing attention that prevented small problems from becoming large ones. I cleaned gutters that had accumulated pine needles and debris from the spring storms. I checked the foundation for any new cracks or signs of moisture intrusion. I tested the sump pump to ensure it was functioning properly and would handle the summer thunderstorms that were already beginning to arrive with increasing frequency. These tasks were unglamorous and often invisible to anyone who did not understand how houses actually worked, but they were essential to preserving the structure and preventing expensive repairs down the line. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the nature of ownership and what it actually meant to possess something. Legal ownership was straightforward in many ways. A matter of documents and recordings and clear chains of title that established who had rights to use, modify, or transfer property. But there was another kind of ownership that went deeper than legal documentation, a kind of possession that came from intimate knowledge and sustained care. I knew this house in ways that no one else could. Knew the places where water tended to collect during heavy rains, knew which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck in humid weather, knew the patterns of sunlight through different seasons and how the wind moved through the pine trees depending on its direction. This intimate knowledge was the result of years of attention, of being present during all phases of the house's transformation from neglected structure to carefully maintained home. Christopher and Madison might want to possess the house legally, might desire to have their names on documents that would give them rights to use and occupy the space. But they could never possess it the way I did, could never know it with the depth that comes from having touched every surface, having made every decision, having solved every problem that arose during the long process of renovation and ongoing maintenance. The distinction mattered more than I would have expected. It clarified what was actually at stake in the conflict that had erupted yesterday morning. Madison wanted a vacation property that would serve her social and professional purposes, a backdrop for the lifestyle she was cultivating and a tool for advancing Christopher's career. She did not want this specific house with its particular history and character. She wanted what the house represented in terms of status and utility. If I had owned a different property that served those purposes equally well, she would have wanted that one instead. The house itself was interchangeable in her mind, valuable only for its instrumental purposes rather than for its intrinsic qualities. This realization helped me understand why she had been so confident that I would eventually surrender. From her perspective, the house was just a thing, a piece of real estate that had financial value and practical utility but no deeper significance. She could not comprehend why anyone would fight to keep something when surrendering it would preserve family harmony and avoid conflict. The idea that the house might be irreplaceable, that it might represent something that could not be recreated or substituted, was simply outside her framework for understanding value and meaning. By late morning the fog had burned off completely and the day had become bright and warm, perfect weather for being outside. I decided to take my kayak out on the lake, needing the physical activity and the particular kind of solitude that comes from being on the water. I had purchased the kayak 3 years earlier from a sporting goods store in Rhinelander, choosing a stable model designed for recreational paddling, rather than speed or performance. I kept it stored on a rack beside the dock, protected from sun and weather by a fitted cover. I launched the kayak and paddled away from shore, following the irregular coastline and observing how the properties looked from the water. Most of the homes along this section of lake were similar to mine in scale and character, modest structures that had been built decades ago as summer cottages and fishing cabins. A few had been renovated and updated like mine, transformed into year-round capable homes with modern systems and improved insulation. Others remained in various states of maintenance or decline, their owners either accepting the rustic character or simply unable or unwilling to invest in improvements. The lake itself was not large by northern Wisconsin standards, perhaps 2 miles long and a mile across at its widest point. It was deep enough to remain cold even in summer, fed by springs and a small creek that entered at the northern end. The water quality was excellent, supporting healthy populations of fish and attracting loons that nested along the more remote shorelines. There were perhaps 40 properties with lake access, spaced far enough apart that each maintained a sense of privacy and separation despite sharing the common resource of the water. As I paddled, I thought about the community that existed here, loose and informal but real nonetheless. I knew many of my neighbors by sight if not by name, recognized their boats and vehicles, understood the rhythms of their use of their properties. There was an elderly couple 3 properties down who had owned their cabin since the 1960s and came up every weekend from May through October. There was a family with young children who used their place primarily during summer vacation and occasional winter weekends. There was a single man about my age who worked remotely and seemed to be at his property nearly full-time, often kayaking early in the morning as I was doing now. These people formed a kind of community based not on proximity of daily life, but on shared appreciation for this particular place and the lifestyle it enabled. We looked out for each other in informal ways, noticing when something seemed wrong at a neighbor's property, helping with tasks that required extra hands, sharing information about local services and weather conditions. It was the kind of community that valued independence and privacy, while also recognizing that remoteness created certain mutual obligations to pay attention and offer assistance when needed. Christopher and Madison would not understand or value this kind of community. They would see neighbors as either useful connections who could advance their social or professional interests, or as a relevant background to their vacation experience. They would not spend time learning the patterns and rhythms of the place, would not develop the kind of ambient awareness that allowed you to notice when something was different or wrong. They would use the property as consumers rather than as members of a community, extracting value without contributing to the informal network of mutual support that made remote living functional and safe. The thought of them occupying my house, of Madison hosting her networking events and Christopher bringing pharmaceutical colleagues up for weekend retreats, filled me with something beyond personal anger. It felt like a kind of violation of the place itself, a corruption of what the property meant and how it functioned within the larger context of this small lakeside community. The house deserved owners who would care for it properly, who would understand and respect its character, who would contribute to rather than merely consume from the network of neighbors who shared this place. I paddled for nearly 2 hours, making a complete circuit of the lake and exploring a few of the smaller bays and inlets that branched off from the main body of water. The physical exertion felt good, using muscles that did not get much engagement during my normal workweek in Milwaukee. When I finally returned to my dock and secured the kayak back on its rack, I felt more centered and clear-headed than I had since the confrontation yesterday morning. I spent the afternoon inside, beginning the detailed documentation process that I knew would be essential if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. I created a comprehensive file that included every piece of paperwork related to the property purchase, including the original sales contract, the closing documents, the deed recording, and the title insurance policy. I compiled all documentation related to the down payment gift from my parents, including the letter they had written at the time explicitly describing the money as an early inheritance with no strings attached, the canceled check, and the gift tax forms they had filed. I created a separate folder for renovation documentation, including receipts for all major purchases of materials and tools, photographs showing the before and during and after states of various rooms and systems, and a detailed log I had maintained throughout the renovation process noting what work had been completed, when and what challenges had been encountered. This documentation served multiple purposes. It established the extent of my investment in the property beyond the initial purchase price. It demonstrated my intimate knowledge of every aspect of the house's systems and structure, and it created a record that would be useful for future maintenance and eventual resale, whenever that might occur decades from now. As I worked through this documentation process, I realized I was also creating something else, a kind of comprehensive narrative of my relationship with this property that went far beyond legal ownership. The accumulated evidence of 7 years of weekends, of countless hours of physical labor, of thousands of small decisions and solved problems, told a story about dedication and vision, and the transformation of potential into reality. It was a story that Christopher and Madison could not tell about this property, because they had not lived it, had not invested the time or effort or care that would give them any legitimate claim to the results. I also began documenting the events of yesterday morning, writing down everything I could remember about the confrontation with as much detail as possible. I noted the specific threats Madison had made, the exact wording she had used when claiming my parents supported their position, and Christopher's silence throughout most of the conversation. I described their arrival time, what they were wearing, how long they stayed, and the fact that they had not been invited and had shown up without any advance warning or request to visit. This documentation felt important even though I had no idea whether it would ever be used in any formal proceeding. It created a contemporaneous record of events while my memory was still fresh and accurate, establishing a baseline of facts that could be referenced later if details became disputed. It also helped me process what had happened by forcing me to examine the encounter analytically rather than simply emotionally, to see the patterns and tactics that had been employed rather than just feeling the hurt and anger of being treated so dismissively in my own home. By early evening, I had created a substantial file of documentation that would support my position if legal action became necessary. I felt prepared in a way I had not felt yesterday, armed with evidence and clear records rather than just conviction and anger. The preparation was empowering, transforming me from someone reacting defensively to someone ready to affirmatively establish and defend my rights through proper channels and procedures. I made dinner and ate on the deck, watching the sun set over the lake and thinking about what Monday would bring. I would need to call attorneys and begin the process of finding legal representation. I would need to have another conversation with my parents, this time making absolutely clear what my position was and what I expected from them in terms of support or at minimum neutrality. I would need to decide how and when to respond to Christopher and Madison, whether to reach out proactively or simply wait for them to take whatever next step they had planned. The 48-hour deadline Madison had imposed would expire tomorrow evening, Monday night at roughly the same time they had shown up yesterday morning. I had no intention of responding by that deadline, no interest in operating on their timeline or according to their expectations. My silence would itself be a response, a refusal to engage with their framing of the situation or accept their assumption that they had any right to impose deadlines or make demands regarding my property. As darkness fell and the lake became a black mirror reflecting scattered stars, I thought about Madison's confidence that she had already won, that my capitulation was merely a matter of time and pressure. She had looked at me and seen someone who could be pushed, someone who valued peace more than principle, someone who would ultimately accept that her interests were less important than her brother's advancement. The assessment was based on decades of observation, on patterns of behavior that had been consistent throughout my life. She had no reason to think this situation would be different from all the other times I had stepped aside, had accepted less, had allowed Christopher's needs to take priority. What she had failed to understand was that those previous capitulations had involved things that were ultimately replaceable or negotiable. Family gatherings where I was overlooked, parental attention that was unequally distributed, recognition and celebration that flowed more readily to Christopher than to me. These things had hurt, but they had not been worth fighting over. Creating conflict over hurt feelings or unequal treatment would have damaged relationships without changing underlying dynamics. The cost of fighting would have exceeded any benefit that might have been achieved. But this situation was fundamentally different. The lake house was not replaceable or negotiable. It was not a matter of hurt feelings or unequal recognition. It was my home, my accomplishment, my proof of capability and autonomy. Fighting to keep it was not about changing other people's perceptions or winning their approval. It was about defending something concrete and irreplaceable, establishing a boundary that should never have needed to be defended in the first place. Madison had miscalculated by assuming that past patterns would predict future behavior, regardless of circumstances. She had not considered that there might be thresholds beyond which accommodation becomes self-betrayal, points where refusing to fight means losing something essential to identity and self-respect. She had seen my history of stepping aside and concluded that I would always step aside, that there was no limit to what I would surrender to avoid conflict. She was about to discover that limits existed, and that she had badly misjudged where those limits were located. The realization would not come immediately, would not arrive in some dramatic confrontation where I announced my intentions and drew clear lines. It would come gradually as I simply failed to respond the way she expected, as her assumptions about my weakness and her own power proved increasingly inaccurate. The lesson would be more effective for arriving slowly, for accumulating through repeated instances of me not behaving according to her predictions. I went inside as the temperature dropped and the night sounds intensified, locking doors and windows with the routine care that living in a remote location requires. The house felt secure around me, solid and protective, a physical manifestation of my own strength and competence. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, whatever steps Christopher and Madison took next, I would face them from this foundation of demonstrated capability and clear rights. The documentation I had compiled today was only the beginning of preparation. I would need to continue building my case, gathering evidence, establishing the comprehensive record that would support my position if legal proceedings became necessary. But the foundation was solid, the core facts clear and well documented. I owned this property solely and completely. I had purchased it with my own money supplemented by an unconditional gift. I had transformed it through my own labor and vision. I maintained it through consistent care and attention. These facts were not in dispute, could not be challenged through clever arguments or legal maneuvering. What Christopher and Madison wanted was irrelevant to these facts. What my parents thought I should do did not change the legal reality of ownership. What family harmony might require as a sacrifice was not my responsibility to provide when the demand itself was completely unreasonable and unjust. I had spent decades managing other people's expectations and accepting that my needs would generally come second to Christopher's. But those decades of accommodation did not create any obligation to continue the pattern indefinitely, did not establish that I had somehow forfeited the right to defend my own interests when they came into genuine conflict with his. The house settled into its nighttime routine of small sounds and shifting temperatures, the creaks and groans that came from wood expanding and contracting, from the building adjusting to the cooling air. I knew all these sounds intimately, could distinguish between normal settling and noises that might indicate problems requiring attention. This knowledge was part of what it meant to truly own something, to be responsible for it in ways that went beyond legal documents and financial obligations. Tomorrow I would begin the formal process of defending my ownership against people who wanted to take it from me. I would find an attorney and establish legal representation. I would have difficult conversations with family members and make clear where boundaries existed. I would begin the work of protecting what I had built against people who believed that wanting something was sufficient justification for taking it. But tonight I simply existed in the space I had created, surrounded by evidence of my own capability, secure in knowledge that was based not on legal arguments but on years of intimate engagement with this place and this structure. They could threaten litigation and claim family loyalty and invoke parental support. They could do all of that and more. But they could not change the fundamental reality that this house was mine in ways that went far deeper than any deed or title document could express. Madison had demanded that I leave my own home. She had given me 48 hours to comply. She had been so confident that pressure and threats would be sufficient to achieve her goals. The confidence was about to prove costly, though she did not yet know it. The lesson would arrive not through dramatic confrontation but through my simple refusal to behave according to her expectations, through my willingness to defend what was mine for as long as necessary and at whatever cost required. The story was continuing to unfold, moving from initial confrontation toward the longer and more complex process of establishing consequences for people who had badly misjudged the person they were attempting to manipulate. I would not be rushed, would not be pressured, would not be moved from my position by anything less than a just resolution that fully protected my rights and interests. They had started this conflict by showing up at my home with demands and ultimatums. I would finish it by demonstrating that being underestimated was actually the most powerful position of all, because it meant no one was prepared for the strength and resolve that would be deployed in defense of what truly mattered. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows weekend storms. The air washed clean and the sunlight sharp enough to make everything look newly defined. I woke earlier than usual, my mind already engaged with the tasks ahead before my body had fully transitioned from sleep to wakefulness. The list of actions I needed to take had been forming throughout the night, organizing itself into logical sequences and priorities even as I slept. By the time I was standing in the kitchen with my first cup of coffee, I had a clear framework for how the day would unfold and what I needed to accomplish before returning to Milwaukee that evening. The first priority was finding legal representation. I had compiled a list of 5 attorneys over the weekend, all of them based in the Rhinelander area and specializing in real estate law and property disputes. I began making calls at 8 o'clock, as soon as I judged that professional offices would be open and staffed. The first 2 attorneys I reached were either unable to take new clients or specialized in commercial rather than residential property matters. The third attorney, a woman named Patricia Whitmore who had been practicing in the area for nearly 20 years, listened to my brief summary of the situation and agreed to meet with me that afternoon at 2 o'clock. The appointment confirmation gave shape and structure to the rest of my day. I would have several hours to continue organizing documentation and preparing for the consultation before I needed to drive into town. I used that time to create a comprehensive timeline of events, starting with my original purchase of the property 7 years ago, and extending through the confrontation with Christopher and Madison on Saturday morning. I noted every significant interaction with family members regarding the property, every visit they had made, every comment that had been made about the house or my choices regarding it. The timeline revealed patterns that I had not fully recognized while living through the individual moments. Christopher and Madison's interest in the property had intensified noticeably over the past year, coinciding with Christopher's mention of being considered for a promotion that would require more client entertainment and relationship building. Their comments during visits had shifted from general criticism of the property's remoteness and rustic character to more specific observations about its potential for hosting events and impressing colleagues. What I had interpreted as casual conversation at the time now appeared in retrospect to be reconnaissance and evaluation, the preliminary stages of a plan that had culminated in Saturday's demand. The recognition was clarifying rather than alarming. Understanding that their approach had been calculated and deliberate, rather than impulsive, helped me appreciate the extent of their commitment to obtaining the property. They had not simply decided on a whim that they wanted my house. They had been planning this acquisition for some time, had consulted with attorneys about legal strategies, had coordinated with my parents to build a case for family support of their position. The level of planning and preparation suggested they were serious about pursuing the matter and would not be easily discouraged by initial resistance. This understanding shaped how I thought about the conflict ahead. I was not dealing with a momentary desire that might fade if I simply refused to engage. I was facing a sustained campaign to take my property, one that would likely involve multiple tactics and escalating pressure over an extended period. The realization was sobering but also useful. It meant I needed to prepare for a long struggle, rather than a brief confrontation, needed to establish sustainable defensive positions, rather than just immediate responses. I spent the late morning hours organizing my documentation into clear categories that would be easy for an attorney to review and understand. I created separate folders for purchase documents, renovation records, financial information, and correspondence with family members. I printed relevant emails and text messages, organizing them chronologically, and adding brief contextual notes where necessary. The process was tedious but essential, transforming scattered information into a coherent narrative that would support my legal position. At 1 o'clock, I drove into Rhinelander for my appointment with Patricia Whitmore. Her office was located in a converted Victorian house on a quiet street near the downtown area, the kind of location that suggested established local practice, rather than aggressive commercial orientation. The waiting area was comfortable without being ostentatious, decorated with what appeared to be original artwork by local artists, and furnished with pieces that were quality without being showy. Patricia Whitmore herself was a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair cut in a practical style and eyes that conveyed both intelligence and a certain wariness that probably came from decades of dealing with human conflict over property and money. She invited me into her office and spent the first few minutes asking general questions about how I had found her practice and what kind of legal assistance I was seeking. Her manner was professional and direct, neither warm nor cold, simply focused on understanding the situation efficiently, so she could provide appropriate guidance. I presented the timeline and documentation I had prepared, walking her through the sequence of events from initial purchase through the weekend confrontation. She listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a legal pad, her expression neutral throughout my narrative. When I finished, she asked several pointed questions about the gift from my parents, about whether I had any written agreements with Christopher regarding shared use of the property, and about the specific threats Madison had made regarding legal action. After reviewing the documentation I had brought, particularly the papers related to the parental gift, Patricia leaned back in her chair and delivered her assessment with the kind of straightforward clarity that I found immediately reassuring. The legal situation was quite simple despite Madison's attempts to make it seem complicated. I was the sole owner of the property as established by the recorded deed. The gift from my parents had been properly documented as a gift with no conditions or expectations of repayment, which meant it created no ownership interest or claim on the property. Unless my parents were willing to commit fraud by falsely claiming they had intended the money as a loan or investment rather than a gift, there was absolutely no legal basis for Christopher to claim any ownership interest in the property. The assessment was exactly what I had concluded from my own research, but hearing it confirmed by someone with professional expertise and decades of experience provided a different kind of certainty. Patricia continued by addressing the potential complications that could arise, even when the legal merits were clearly on one side. Family property disputes often became emotional and expensive regardless of the underlying legal reality. Christopher and Madison could file nuisance lawsuits that would require me to respond and defend, even if their claims had no merit. They could attempt to tie up the property in litigation that would prevent me from selling or refinancing, even if they had no realistic chance of actually obtaining ownership. They could use the legal system as a weapon to impose costs and stress, even if they ultimately could not win on the substantive issues. This analysis confirmed my instinct that the threat itself was part of the strategy, regardless of whether litigation would actually succeed. The goal was to make fighting so unpleasant and expensive that I would eventually agree to some kind of settlement or compromise simply to end the conflict. Patricia explained that this approach was unfortunately common in family disputes where one party had more financial resources than the other, and could use that advantage to wage war of attrition, rather than fighting on the legal merits. I asked what it would cost to defend my ownership if Christopher and Madison chose to pursue litigation. Patricia provided a range that was sobering but not impossible, explaining that much would depend on how aggressively they pursued their claims, and whether they were willing to take the matter through multiple levels of proceedings. A relatively straightforward defense might cost $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees. A more complex and drawn-out battle could easily exceed $50,000 depending on how many motions and hearings and appeals were involved. The numbers were significant but manageable given my savings and the equity I had built in the property. More importantly, Patricia explained that if Christopher and Madison filed claims that a court determined to be frivolous or brought in bad faith, I might be able to recover my attorney fees from them. This possibility created at least some deterrent against purely strategic litigation, designed to impose costs, rather than to vindicate legitimate rights. If they knew that losing would mean paying not just their own legal fees but mine as well, they might be more cautious about filing baseless claims. We discussed strategy for the immediate future. Patricia advised that I should not respond to Christopher and Madison's demands or threats, should not engage in any negotiations or discussions about transferring or sharing the property. Any communication from this point forward should go through her office rather than directly between family members. This would create a clear record of all interactions, and would prevent me from saying or writing anything that could be used against me if litigation proceeded. She would prepare a formal letter to Christopher and Madison, and to my parents if necessary, establishing that I was represented by counsel, and that any further communication regarding the property should be directed to her office. The consultation lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end I felt I had found exactly the right attorney for the situation. Patricia was experienced and knowledgeable without being alarmist or unnecessarily aggressive. She understood both the legal issues and the family dynamics that complicated straightforward property disputes. Most importantly, she seemed to respect my determination to defend my ownership, rather than trying to convince me that compromise or settlement would be easier and more practical. She recognized that this was about more than money or convenience, that defending the property was essential to maintaining my sense of autonomy and accomplishment. I left her office with a clear action plan and a retainer agreement to sign in return. She would prepare the formal communication establishing legal representation, and demanding that all contacts cease except through appropriate channels. She would also begin preparing a more comprehensive legal analysis that would address every potential claim Christopher and Madison might raise, creating a thorough defense before any actual litigation was filed. The proactive approach would put us in the strongest possible position if conflict escalated, while also demonstrating to the other side that I was serious and prepared rather than vulnerable and reactive. The drive back to the lake house took me through the small downtown area of Rhinelander, past the shops and restaurants that served both local residents and tourists who came to the area for outdoor recreation. I stopped at a local grocery store to pick up supplies for the week ahead, stocking up on shelf-stable items that I could keep at the lake house for future weekends. The mundane task of grocery shopping felt grounding after the intensity of the legal consultation, a reminder that life continued with its ordinary requirements and rhythms regardless of larger conflicts and challenges. When I returned to the house, I spent the remaining afternoon hours taking care of outdoor tasks that needed attention before I left for the week. I checked the dock for any loose boards or hardware that might need tightening or replacement. I inspected the deck railing to ensure everything remained secure and stable. I walked the property line along the eastern boundary, checking the survey markers and noting a few small trees that would need to be removed before they grew large enough to cause problems with sightlines or root systems. These maintenance tasks provided the same kind of meditative clarity that physical labor always offered me. There was something deeply satisfying about identifying problems and solving them directly through appropriate action. A loose board needed tightening, so you tightened it. A dead tree needed removal, so you cut it down and cleared away the debris. The simplicity of physical maintenance created a welcome contrast to the complexity of legal and family conflicts, where problems could not be solved through straightforward application of skill and effort. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, I became aware that Madison's 48-hour deadline was approaching. By her timeline, I should be preparing to respond to their demands, to either agree to their terms or at least engage in negotiation about how the property might be transferred or shared. The deadline had been designed to create pressure and urgency, to force me into hasty decisions before I could fully consider my options or prepare appropriate responses. Instead, I was spending the final hours before the deadline doing routine property maintenance and preparing to drive back to Milwaukee for my work week. I had no intention of acknowledging the deadline or responding to their demands on their timeline. My silence would itself be the message, a refusal to accept their framing of the situation or their assumption that they had any right to impose conditions or ultimatums regarding my property. I understood that my failure to respond would likely be interpreted as defiance rather than simple non-engagement, and that interpretation might lead to escalation of their tactics. But escalation was inevitable regardless of how I responded in the short term. If I attempted to negotiate or compromise, they would interpret that as weakness and would simply increase their demands. If I responded with anger or defensiveness, they would use that emotional reaction as evidence that I was unstable or unreasonable. The only response that served my interests was no response at all, a simple refusal to participate in the game they were attempting to play. By 6 o'clock, I had completed my preparations for departure. The house was secured, with all systems checked and everything left in good order for my return the following weekend. I loaded my car with the items I needed to bring back to Milwaukee, including the documentation I had prepared for the legal consultation and the retainer agreement I needed to sign and return to Patricia Whitmore's office. I took a final walk around the property, saying a kind of temporary goodbye to the place that had become so central to my sense of identity and purpose. The drive back to Milwaukee took slightly over 4 hours, with traffic building as I approached the metropolitan area. I arrived at my apartment in the city just after 10 o'clock, tired from the long day but also energized by the clarity and forward momentum that had emerged from the weekend's challenges. I had faced the initial confrontation, had processed the shock and betrayal of my family's alignment against my interests, and had taken concrete steps to establish legal defense of my rights. The situation was far from resolved, but I was no longer reacting defensively to unexpected threats. I was moving forward with clear strategy and professional support. Tuesday morning I returned to my regular work routine, arriving at the engineering firm's offices at my usual time, and diving into the projects and meetings that filled my professional schedule. The familiarity of the work environment and the technical challenges of infrastructure design provided welcome distraction from the property conflict. For 8 hours I could focus entirely on solving drainage problems and reviewing structural plans, engaging with challenges that had clear solutions and measurable outcomes. During my lunch break, I signed the retainer agreement with Patricia Whitmore and scanned it back to her office along with the initial payment that would establish our attorney-client relationship. I also sent her a brief email confirming details we had discussed during our consultation and providing contact information for Christopher and Madison. The administrative tasks felt significant despite their routine nature. They represented the formal establishment of legal defense, the transformation of personal conflict into a matter that would now be handled through appropriate professional channels. Wednesday brought the first response from the other side. I received an email from Christopher, the first direct communication from him since the Saturday morning confrontation. The tone was wounded and confused, expressing hurt that I had not responded to their reasonable request for a family meeting to discuss the property situation. He wrote that he and Madison had been giving me space to think about their proposal, but my silence was starting to seem like hostility rather than contemplation. He suggested that we all sit down together with Mom and Dad present to work out an arrangement that would be fair to everyone and would keep the property in the family where it belonged. The email was carefully crafted to make me appear unreasonable for not engaging in discussion. It reframed their demands as a reasonable request for a meeting, their ultimatums as a generous offer of family involvement in what should be a mutual decision. The manipulation was transparent but still effective in creating a narrative where I was the problem, the family member who was refusing to communicate and compromise, the sister who valued a house more than relationships with her only brother and parents. I forwarded the email to Patricia without responding directly to Christopher. She replied within an hour, confirming that this was exactly the kind of communication that should be handled through her office, rather than directly between family members. She would send the letter she had prepared, establishing legal representation and directing all future communication through appropriate channels. The letter would be formal and clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation about my position or my unwillingness to engage in negotiation regarding property that was solely mine. Thursday evening brought a phone call from my mother. I saw her name on my phone screen and hesitated before answering, knowing the conversation would be difficult but also recognizing that avoiding it indefinitely was not sustainable. I answered on the fourth ring, keeping my voice neutral and controlled. My mother began by expressing concern about family tensions and suggesting that everyone was overreacting to what should be a simple discussion about how to best use family resources. She acknowledged that the lake house was legally mine, but suggested that ownership was less important than finding solutions that worked for everyone. Christopher and Madison were in a position where having access to vacation property could really benefit Christopher's career, and surely I could understand that families should support each other during important professional transitions. I listened without interrupting, letting her complete her entire argument before I responded. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice calm and factual rather than emotional or accusatory. I explained that the house was not a family resource to be allocated, according to collective decisions about who could benefit most from its use. It was my personal property that I had purchased with my own money and transformed through years of my own labor. Christopher and Madison's desire to use it for career advancement did not create any obligation for me to provide access, much less to transfer ownership or control. My mother's tone shifted from conciliatory to frustrated. She said I was being stubborn and selfish, that I had always been difficult about accepting that family required compromise and mutual support. She suggested that my attachment to the house was unhealthy, that I was using it as an excuse to avoid building the kind of life that included relationships and family connections. The implication was clear enough. My investment in the property was evidence of something wrong with me rather than evidence of capability and vision. I felt the familiar weight of parental disappointment, the sense that nothing I accomplished would ever quite measure up to what they wished I had chosen. But I also felt something new, a kind of clarity that came from recognizing that their disappointment was based on fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I valued. They wanted me to be someone different, someone whose priorities aligned with their vision of appropriate adult life. But I was not that person, had never been that person, and continuing to pretend otherwise served no useful purpose. I told my mother that I had retained legal counsel, and that any further discussion about the property should go through my attorney's office. I explained that this was not about hostility or unwillingness to communicate, but rather about ensuring that conversations remained focused on facts and legal rights, rather than emotional manipulation and family pressure. I said that I loved her and Dad, but that my relationship with them could not be contingent on my willingness to surrender my property to Christopher whenever his career advancement might benefit from having access to it. The conversation ended shortly after that, with my mother expressing disappointment and hurt that I was treating a family matter like a legal dispute. I gently pointed out that Christopher and Madison had made it a legal matter by threatening litigation and claiming ownership, rights they did not possess. I had simply responded appropriately to threats by establishing proper legal defense. If they wanted the situation to be less adversarial, they could begin by withdrawing their demands and acknowledging my sole ownership of property that had always been exclusively mine. Friday morning brought the formal letter from Patricia Whitmore's office, delivered both by email and certified mail to Christopher and Madison at their Lake Forest address and copied to my parents at their Milwaukee home. The letter was exactly what I had hoped for, clear and professional without being unnecessarily aggressive, establishing facts without emotional language, and making absolutely plain that I would defend my ownership through whatever legal proceedings became necessary. The letter confirmed that I was the sole legal owner of the property located on Crescent Island, that this ownership was established through properly recorded deed, and supported by clear chain of title, going back through legitimate purchase. It noted that any claims suggesting shared ownership or family rights to the property were without legal foundation, and would be vigorously contested if asserted through litigation. It directed that all future communication regarding the property should be sent to Patricia's office rather than to me directly, and it warned that any continued harassment or intimidation regarding the property might result in additional legal action to protect my rights and interests. The letter transformed the situation from family conflict into legal matter, establishing clear boundaries and professional distance that would make it much more difficult for Christopher and Madison to continue their campaign of pressure and manipulation. They would now have to decide whether they were willing to actually retain their own attorney and pursue formal litigation, or whether the threats had been primarily tactical and would fade when confronted with serious legal opposition. I spent that Friday evening at my Milwaukee apartment organizing my thoughts and planning for the weekend ahead. I would return to the lake house as usual, would continue my normal routine of property maintenance and outdoor projects, would live my life as though nothing had changed because fundamentally nothing had changed. The house remained mine. My ownership remained absolute and unchallenged by any legitimate legal claim. The threats and demands had not altered these facts, had only made explicit what had always been true. Some people believed they were entitled to take what others had built, and those people needed to learn that entitlement was not the same as rights. The weekend arrived with the particular quality of anticipation that comes from knowing you are waiting for something without being certain what form it will take or when it will arrive. I drove north to the lake house Friday evening, making the familiar journey through progressively smaller towns and increasingly dense forest until the paved roads gave way to gravel and the lights of civilization faded into the darkness of preserved wilderness. The house appeared in my headlights exactly as I had left it the previous Sunday, solid and welcoming, a physical manifestation of everything I had built and everything I was now defending. I spent Saturday morning working on a project I had been planning for months, the installation of a rain garden in a low area near the driveway where water tended to collect during heavy storms. The rain garden would serve multiple purposes, capturing and filtering runoff before it could carry sediment into the lake, creating habitat for native plants and the insects and birds they supported, and transforming a problem area into an attractive landscape feature. The work required careful attention to grades and drainage patterns, to plant selection based on tolerance for both saturated and dry conditions, and to the aesthetic arrangement of various species to create visual interest throughout multiple seasons. The physical labor was absorbing in the way that complex projects always were, demanding enough attention that my mind could not wander to other concerns but not so technically challenging that I felt stressed or uncertain. I had researched rain garden design extensively, had consulted with a landscape architect colleague about proper specifications, and had ordered plants from a native species nursery that specialized in restoration projects. The implementation was simply a matter of following the plan I had developed, making minor adjustments as actual conditions revealed details that planning could not have anticipated. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the nature of creation and how it differed fundamentally from acquisition. Christopher and Madison wanted to acquire my house, to take possession of something that already existed in finished form. They had no interest in the process of transformation that had turned a neglected structure into a carefully maintained home, no appreciation for the accumulated knowledge and skill that made such transformation possible. They saw only the end result and wanted to claim it without having invested anything in the journey that had produced it. This distinction felt increasingly important as I thought about the conflict and what it revealed about different approaches to living in the world. I had spent 7 years engaged in the slow process of building something meaningful through sustained effort and learning. Every weekend had brought new challenges and small victories, problems that needed solving and skills that needed developing. The house in its current form was not something I had purchased or inherited. It was something I had created through the accumulation of thousands of individual decisions and actions, each one requiring thought and care and willingness to learn from mistakes. Christopher and Madison's approach to life was fundamentally different. They acquired things that already existed in desirable form, using money and social connections to obtain access to experiences and possessions that others had created. There was nothing inherently wrong with this approach. Society functioned through specialization and exchange, with people purchasing goods and services rather than producing everything themselves. But their approach meant they never developed the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from building something yourself, never experienced the particular satisfaction of solving problems through your own ingenuity and persistence. The rain garden took most of the day to install, requiring careful excavation to create the proper bowl shape, amendment of the soil with compost and sand to improve drainage characteristics, and precise placement of plants according to their tolerance for varying moisture levels. By late afternoon, the project was complete, transformed from a muddy depression into a deliberately designed landscape feature that would improve both the property's ecological function and its visual appeal. I stood back and surveyed the work with the satisfaction that comes from seeing a plan successfully executed, from knowing that I had added something of value through my own effort and vision. Saturday evening passed quietly, with no communication from Christopher or Madison or my parents. The silence was notable given the intensity of the previous weekend's confrontation and the formal legal letter that had been delivered the previous day. I had expected some kind of response, either angry or conciliatory, either threatening further escalation or proposing some kind of negotiated resolution. Instead, there was simply silence, an absence of contact that felt more ominous than any explicit communication would have been. I spent Sunday morning kayaking on the lake, enjoying the early summer weather and the particular quality of solitude that comes from being on the water far from shore. The lake was busier than it had been the previous weekend, with several other boats visible and the sounds of distant conversation and laughter carrying across the water. Summer season was beginning in earnest, with families arriving at their vacation properties for extended stays and weekends. The increased activity created a different atmosphere than the emptiness of early spring, more social and communal, but also more crowded and less private. As I paddled along the shoreline, I noticed increased activity at several neighboring properties. The elderly couple 3 houses down were working in their garden, preparing beds for the vegetables they grew every summer. The family with young children had arrived and were setting up water toys and beach equipment on their small stretch of sandy shore. The remote worker who lived at his property full-time was sitting on his dock with a laptop, apparently taking advantage of the pleasant weather to work outside. The small community was coming alive as seasonal residents returned and weather permitted more outdoor activity. I found myself appreciating this community in new ways, recognizing it as something valuable that existed independently of any individual property or owner. The lake and the land around it created opportunities for a particular kind of life, one that balanced solitude with connection, independence with mutual support, relationship with nature alongside human community. This way of living required certain values and commitments, including respect for the environment, consideration for neighbors, and willingness to handle the practical challenges that came with remote location and seasonal weather extremes. Christopher and Madison would not fit naturally into this community because their values and priorities were fundamentally different. They would see the lake house as a possession to be displayed and utilized rather than as a responsibility to be maintained and a privilege to be honored. They would view neighbors as either useful connections or irrelevant strangers, rather than as fellow members of a community built on shared appreciation for place and lifestyle. Their presence would change the character of the property and its relationship to the surrounding community in ways that felt like loss, rather than simply like change. This recognition added another dimension to my determination to defend my ownership. I was not just protecting my personal investment and accomplishment. I was also protecting the integrity of this small community and the way of life it represented. Allowing the property to pass to people who did not understand or respect its character would be a kind of betrayal of the place itself and the other people who had chosen to make their lives here. Sunday afternoon brought unexpected visitors. I was working in the garage organizing tools and supplies when I heard a vehicle approaching on the gravel driveway. I stepped outside and was surprised to see not Christopher's luxury SUV, but my parents' sedan pulling up to the house. My father was driving with my mother in the passenger seat, both of them looking uncomfortable and uncertain in a way that was unusual for people who had always projected confidence and control in family matters. I walked toward the car as they were getting out, my mind racing through possible reasons for this unannounced visit and what it might mean for the larger conflict. My father spoke first, his voice carrying a formal quality that suggested he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He explained that they had driven up to talk with me in person because the situation had become too complicated and emotional to handle through phone calls and messages. They wanted to understand my position and to see if there was some way to resolve the conflict that would preserve family relationships while addressing everyone's legitimate needs and concerns. I invited them inside despite my reluctance to have this conversation in the space that was so intimately mine. We sat in the living room, my parents on the sofa that faced the lake view and me in the armchair that I typically use for reading in the evenings. The arrangement felt oddly formal, more like a business meeting than a family visit, but perhaps that formality was appropriate given the circumstances. My mother began by expressing how painful it was to see her children in conflict, how distressing it felt to watch the family divide over property disputes, when family connection should be more important than material possessions. She acknowledged that the house was legally mine, but suggested that legal ownership was less important than finding solutions that worked for everyone. She painted a picture of potential compromise where Christopher and Madison could use the house for important career-related events, while I retained ownership, and continued to use it for my personal recreation. Surely some kind of shared arrangement could be developed that would give everyone access without requiring anyone to give up their interests entirely. I listened to the entire proposal before responding, recognizing it as a more sophisticated version of the same fundamental demand that had been presented the previous weekend. The details were different, framed as compromise rather than ultimatum, but the core expectation remained the same. I was supposed to surrender control of my property to accommodate Christopher's career needs, to accept that my interests were less important than his professional advancement, to demonstrate family loyalty by sacrificing what I had built so that he could benefit from it without having contributed anything to its creation. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice calm and factual, presenting my position without anger or defensiveness. I explained that the house was not simply a vacation property or a family asset to be allocated according to collective decisions. It was my home, the physical manifestation of 7 years of work and vision, the proof of my capability and autonomy. Sharing control of the property with Christopher and Madison would fundamentally change what it was and what it meant to me. The house would no longer be mine in any meaningful sense. It would become a resource managed by committee, subject to negotiations and compromises about scheduling and usage, transformed from a place of refuge and independence into another arena where my needs would be balanced against Christopher's, and would inevitably be found less important. My father interjected, suggesting that I was being inflexible and refusing to see the bigger picture. He pointed out that Christopher's career success benefited the whole family through his ability to provide well for Madison and any future children they might have. He suggested that helping Christopher advance professionally was a form of investment in family prosperity that would ultimately benefit everyone, including me. The logic was familiar and deeply flawed, premised on the assumption that Christopher's success created value for others, rather than primarily benefiting Christopher himself, and that family members had obligations to sacrifice their own interests to support his advancement. I responded by asking a question that had been forming in my mind throughout the conversation. If Christopher's career advancement was so important to family prosperity, why were they asking me to sacrifice my property rather than contributing from their own resources? They could help Christopher purchase his own vacation property if they believed it would benefit his career. They could offer to co-sign a loan or provide a down payment gift similar to what they had given me. They had options for supporting him that did not require taking from me what I had built. The silence that followed my question was revealing. My mother looked uncomfortable, and my father's expression shifted from reasonable negotiation to something closer to irritation. Finally, my father explained that their retirement savings were carefully planned and could not be disrupted by large expenditures for property purchases. They had already helped both children through down payment gifts years ago and could not be expected to provide additional major financial support at their stage of life. The double standard was so blatant that I almost laughed. They could not help Christopher purchase property because it would disrupt their financial planning, but they expected me to give up property I already owned because that sacrifice would not cost them anything. They were asking me to absorb the entire cost of supporting Christopher's career, while they maintained their comfortable retirement plans. The asymmetry revealed everything about how they viewed their children, and whose interests actually mattered when difficult choices needed to be made. I pointed out this contradiction as gently as I could manage, explaining that their position seemed to be that Christopher's career was important enough to justify my sacrifice but not important enough to justify theirs. This did not strike me as a reasonable or fair approach to family support. If they truly believed that helping Christopher was essential to family prosperity, they should be willing to contribute from their own resources rather than simply demanding that I contribute from mine. My mother's response was sharp and wounded, suggesting that I was being cruel and deliberately misunderstanding their position. They were not asking me to give up the house entirely, just to be flexible about sharing access so that Christopher could use it when he needed it for professional purposes. This was a small sacrifice that would cost me nothing since I was only at the property on weekends anyway, and could easily coordinate my visits around Christopher's needs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.